The silence was the first thing Brian noticed. It wasn't the usual quiet of an empty house, the kind filled with the familiar hum of the refrigerator or the comforting tick of the grandfather clock in the hall. In fact, the clock was silent, its pendulum a motionless brass disc, something Brian had never seen in his life. His father was meticulous about keeping it wound. This was a deep, listening silence, the kind that feels like a held breath, absorbing all other sounds into its oppressive weight. At 17, Brian was more than old enough to be left alone for the weekend, a fact he had celebrated with loud music and a frozen pizza feast just hours before. But now, with the sun long gone and the house cloaked in the impenetrable, starless dark of the suburbs, the silence felt heavy, watchful, and deeply wrong. It felt personal. He was sprawled on the living room couch, the blue light of the TV flickering across his face, the movie dialogue a thin barrier against the quiet. That's when he heard the first sound that didn't belong. A soft thump from upstairs, directly above him in his parents' bedroom. It was immediately followed by a faint, dragging shuffle, like a heavy piece of furniture being pulled slowly across the hardwood floor. Probably just the house settling, he told himself, pulling a throw blanket tighter around his shoulders. The old two-story had a whole symphony of groans and creaks he knew by heart. This one, however, was a new and unwelcome note in the composition. Less like wood contracting and more like a reluctant footstep taken by someone unsure of their balance. He muted the TV. The silence rushed back in, now laced with a sharp thread of anxiety that prickled his skin. He strained his ears, listening for anything else, every nerve ending tingling. The house remained still. Nothing. He was being stupid, letting the dark play tricks on him. He was about to turn the volume back up when he saw it. In the large bay window that faced the front yard, a reflection of the living room was cast against the blackness of the night. His own reflection stared back, pale and wide-eyed. And standing just behind his shoulder in the reflection, where there was only empty air, was the figure of a woman. She was tall and unnaturally thin, her limbs like sticks wrapped in the tattered, dark fabric of a dress from another century. Her hair was long, black, and stringy, hanging over her face like a funeral veil, so that no features were visible. Her head was tilted slightly as if listening intently to a sound only she could hear, a faint, high-pitched whine that Brian now realized he could almost perceive at the edge of his own hearing. She was perfectly still, yet seemed to vibrate with a terrible, contained energy. Brian's blood ran cold, a feeling like ice water pouring through his veins. He whipped his head around, his heart hammering against his ribs in a painful, frantic rhythm that echoed in his ears. The space behind the couch was empty. The air was still and warm. He slowly, hesitantly, turned back to the window. The reflection showed only him, alone and trembling in the room. A trick of the light, a shadow. It had to be. He let out a shaky breath, the laugh that followed, sounding more like a sob. He scrambled off the couch and walked to the window, his legs unsteady. He peered out into the empty, moonlit street. Nothing. He pressed his palm against the glass. It was unnaturally cold, chilling him to the bone despite the warmth of the house. With a shaking hand, he drew the thick curtains, shutting out the night. But the image of her was seared into his mind. A permanent afterimage burned onto his retinas. He decided to make a sweep of the house, a heavy aluminum baseball bat gripped tightly in his hand, its weight a small comfort against the rising tide of fear. He checked the locks on the front and back doors, sliding the deadbolts home with a loud, satisfying clack. He made sure every window was latched. Everything was secure. He moved upstairs, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous quiet. He checked his parents' room, the source of the noise. The bed was neatly made, the air still and cold. The door to his mother's walk-in closet, however, was ajar. A sliver of profound blackness in the gloom. He knew for a fact his parents always kept it closed. He pushed it shut, a primal fear preventing him from looking inside, from seeing what might be huddled in the corner amongst his mother's dresses. He moved on, checking the guest room, the bathroom. All empty. As he passed the closed door to the attic, a faint, sickly sweet smell wafted out from under it. like old flowers and damp earth, with an undercurrent of something metallic and coppery, like old pennies. He shuddered and hurried back to his own room, locking the door behind him. He tried to sleep, but every creak of the house made him jump. He kept picturing the woman in the reflection, the way she just stood there. Sometime after midnight, just as he was drifting into a restless, dream-filled slumber, he was jolted awake. A floorboard in the hall outside his room groaned, a single, deliberate sound of weight being settled. And then it began. A slow, deliberate scratching at his bedroom door. It sounded like fingernails, long, hard nails, dragging down the wood, methodically and without hurry. It started near the bottom of the door, then slowly traveled upward, as if something was testing its height before descending again. Brian lay frozen in his bed, every muscle tensed into a painful knot. He held his breath, praying for it to stop. A faint, wet sigh, like air being drawn through fluid, whispered through the keyhole, and for a horrifying second, he thought he heard his own name, drawn out and distorted. The scratching continued for what felt like an eternity before finally falling silent. He didn't move for an hour, his eyes fixed on the door, expecting the handle to turn at any moment. It never did. Dawn eventually broke, painting his room in thin gray stripes of light. The house was quiet again, but it was no longer a comforting silence. It was the silence of a predator waiting. Exhausted and terrified, Brian knew he couldn't stay in the house another night. He'd call a friend, say the loneliness was getting to him, and beg to stay over. He crept out of his room, the bat held high. The upstairs hallway was empty. He looked at his door. The scratching had left long, deep gouges in the paint, splintering the wood. The raw grooves were filled with a dark, flaky substance that looked like dried mud or dead skin. The sight made his stomach clench with nausea. He tiptoed down the stairs, his eyes scanning every shadow, every corner, expecting her to leap out at any moment. He was halfway across the living room, heading for the phone in the kitchen, when he saw her again. She wasn't in a reflection this time. She was standing in the kitchen, her back to him, facing the sink, slowly running a single, long finger under the dripping faucet. The same tall, gaunt figure. The same tattered dress and long black hair. A low, discordant humming sound came from her, a broken off-key lullaby that made the hairs on Brian's arms stand on end. He could see one of her pale, long-fingered hands resting on the counter. The fingernails were yellowed, overgrown, and curved like talons. He started to back away, his mind a primal scream of run, run, run. He had to get out, to get away from the house. But as he moved, a floorboard groaned under his weight. A cannon shot in the stillness. The humming and the dripping water stopped simultaneously. The figure in the kitchen went rigid. For a long, horrifying moment, there was absolute silence. Then, with a sound like cracking knuckles amplified 100-fold, a symphony of pops and snaps, her neck began to turn. Her head swiveled around, slow and jerky, a movement that seemed to defy the limits of anatomy, while her body remained perfectly still, facing the sink. Brian didn't wait to see the face hidden behind the curtain of hair. He stumbled backward, falling over an ottoman, and scrambled on all fours before finding his feet. He bolted, yanking at the front door's deadbolt with clumsy, uncooperative fingers, as he heard a soft, dry shuffling from the kitchen, the sound of brittle leaves skittering across pavement. The lock finally gave way, and he sprinted out into the morning chill without looking back. His parents returned that evening to an empty house and a dozen frantic voicemails. They found Brian at a friend's house, pale and rambling incoherently about a woman in the house. They searched the entire property, finding nothing but the deep scratches on his bedroom door, which they attributed to the dog, even though they'd taken the dog with them. His father tried to be logical, suggesting a bad dream or a prank. His mother looked at him with a deep, worried pity that was somehow worse than disbelief. When they got home, Brian noticed that the grandfather clock in the hall was ticking again, its pendulum swinging in its steady, familiar rhythm. On the kitchen counter, next to the sink, sat a single wilted black rose that hadn't been there before. His parents didn't seem to notice. Brian refused to sleep in that house again, a refusal so absolute and terrified that it eventually fractured his family. He never told them the last part, the part that truly mattered. He couldn't. How could he explain the impossible without them thinking he was truly insane? He never told them that as he fled down the driveway, a desperate, self-destructive curiosity had forced him to risk a single, fleeting glance back through the bay window. The woman had been standing there, waiting for him to look, her form silhouetted against the dark interior. And in the bright, unforgiving morning sun, he could finally see her face as the curtain of hair fell away. It was a blank, smooth canvas of pale skin, devoid of eyes, a nose, or a mouth. Nothing but a horrifying, featureless mask of flesh that seemed to ripple, as if the features were still there, struggling just beneath the surface. It was the face of a forgotten memory, an entity that had been waiting in the silence of the house not for just anyone, but for him. And in that horrifying final moment, before he tore his eyes away, he saw the smooth skin pucker and stretch as if it was trying to form a smile. The rain fell in relentless, slanting sheets, drumming a somber rhythm against the window pane of Carol's bedroom. It was the kind of night that swallowed sound, wrapping the old house in a damp, suffocating silence. The house itself, a relic from a time when foundations were laid with secrets as much as stone, seemed to groan under the assault of the storm. Inside, the only light came from a single desk lamp, which cast a warm, golden pool over a daunting fortress of textbooks. Carol, a junior in college, was neck-deep in 18th century European economic theory. Her parents were out for the weekend visiting an aunt, leaving her the sole occupant. She usually preferred it that way. The quiet was a fragile shield she wrapped around her concentration. She was just starting to make sense of a particularly dense chapter when she first heard it. It was faint, almost imperceptible, a high, thin sound that slipped through the drumming of the rain like a needle. She paused, her pen hovering over the page. It sounded like crying, a child's cry. Probably just the wind, she thought, shaking her head. The house was old, full of strange acoustics and drafts that whistled through unseen cracks. It settled inside with every shift in the weather. She read the same paragraph 3 times, her mind refusing to absorb the words, snagged on that single, ghostly note of sound. Getting up, she peered through the rain-streaked glass, seeing only the slick black asphalt of the street and the blurred lights of a distant neighbor. Nothing. Then it came again, a little louder this time, clearer. It was undeniably the sound of a little girl weeping, a heartbreaking, desolate sob that seemed to carry an immense weight of sadness. A chill, entirely separate from the damp night air, traced a path down Carol's spine. It sounded close, frighteningly close, as if it were just on the other side of the glass. She pushed her chair back, the legs scraping noisily against the hardwood floor. The sound stopped instantly. The only noise was the rain and the frantic thumping of her own heart against her ribs. She held her breath, listening, straining her ears against the silence. "Hello?" she called out, her voice feeling small and thin in the large house. "Is someone there?" No response. She felt a surge of foolishness. Of course, no one was there. It was a stray cat, or the neighbor's TV carrying on the wind. She sat back down, determined to ignore it. But the seed of unease had been planted. The familiar comfort of her room now felt fragile, the shadows in the corners deeper, seeming to stretch and writhe just at the edge of her vision. An hour crawled by. The rain softened to a persistent drizzle. Carol had put on headphones, blasting classical music in a futile attempt to barricade her focus. But the feeling of being watched, a prickling on the back of her neck, never left. She took the headphones off and the house felt unnervously still. She was highlighting a key passage when the crying started again, and this time it was impossible to ignore. It wasn't faint or distant, it was in the house. It sounded as if it were coming from just outside her bedroom door, a series of gut-wrenching sobs followed by a choked, desperate gasp for air. It was the sound of pure, untempered misery. Carol's blood ran cold. Every rational explanation evaporated. This wasn't the wind. This wasn't a TV. It was real. Someone, a child, was in her house. Slowly, she stood up, her limbs feeling heavy and unresponsive. Her phone lay on the desk, but the idea of calling someone felt premature, insane. What would I say? I think there's a ghost crying in my hallway? Her hand trembled as she reached for the brass doorknob. It felt ice cold to the touch, a deep, unnatural cold that seemed to sap the warmth from her fingertips. Taking a deep, ragged breath, she turned it and pulled the door open a few inches. The hallway was dim, steeped in shadows that her bedroom light couldn't quite pierce. It was empty. The crying had stopped the instant the latch clicked. The silence that followed was worse than the sound itself. It was a heavy, expectant silence, thick with unspoken dread. The air in the hall was frigid. She could see her own breath plume in front of her. She wasn't alone. Against her better judgment, she stepped into the hallway. "Who's there?" she whispered, her voice cracking. A floorboard creaked downstairs, a sharp splintering sound from the living room. Carol froze, her ears straining. She crept to the top of the staircase, her bare feet shrinking from the cold wood. Peering down into the cavernous darkness of the first floor, she saw nothing but the familiar shapes of furniture cloaked in shadow. Then she heard it again, a single, soft sob, drifting up from below. Driven by a terrifying mix of fear and a strange protective instinct, she started down the stairs. Her phone was now clenched in her hand, its flashlight cutting a shaky, nervous path in front of her. Each step groaned under her weight, the sound deafening in the stillness. The banister was slick with a cold condensation. The flashlight beam danced and jittered, making the shadows leap away like startled animals. Halfway down, she paused, her heart hammering. Every instinct screamed at her to run back to her room, lock the door, and hide under the covers until morning. But the sound of that desolate weeping pulled her onward. She reached the bottom of the stairs, the cold intensifying, and swept the light across the living room. The couch, the armchairs, the fireplace. All were exactly as they should be. But the weeping was louder here, raw and immediate. It seemed to be coming from the far corner of the room, near the old bay window where the curtains were drawn. Her light beam followed the sound, and then she saw it. Huddled in the corner with its back to her was the small figure of a girl. She looked to be about 6 or 7 years old, wearing a simple, old-fashioned white nightdress. Her thin shoulders shook with each heart-rending sob. A wave of relief, so powerful it almost made Carol's knees buckle, washed over her. It was a real child. She must have wandered in somehow, the back door left unlocked. "Hey," Carol said softly, taking a cautious step forward. "Are you okay? How did you get in here? It's late." The girl didn't turn around. She just kept crying, her small hands covering her face. "Don't cry," Carol said, her voice gentle and reassuring. She took another step, the floorboards groaning. "It's all right. We'll find your mommy and daddy, I promise." As she got closer, she noticed something odd. The girl's nightdress seemed almost translucent, and the flashlight beam passed through the edges of it. The air around her was a pocket of absolute zero, so cold it made Carol's teeth ache. The weeping began to change, the sorrowful sobs slowly twisting, the pitch distorting into something metallic and wrong. Carol stopped, a fresh spike of fear piercing through her relief. "What's your name?" The girl finally lowered her hands from her face, but she didn't turn around. The crying stopped completely. She spoke in a voice that was not a child's voice at all. It was a low, guttural rasp, like dry leaves skittering across pavement. "I can't find my eyes." Carol's flashlight beam wavered, the circle of light trembling violently on the wall. What did you say?" The little girl slowly began to turn. Her movements were jerky, unnatural, like a puppet on tangled strings, accompanied by the faint, wet sound of cracking joints. "He took them," the raspy voice whispered from the small frame, "and he hid them in the walls." The figure turned to face her fully. Carol's scream was a choked, strangled thing that died in her throat. The child's face was a pale, smooth mask of skin. There were no eyes, just two dark, empty, weeping sockets, from which a thick black substance trickled down her cheeks, like oily tears dripping onto the pristine white of her nightdress. The eyeless face tilted, a grotesque parody of curiosity. The lipless mouth stretched into a wide, impossibly black grin, splitting the pale face with a void of darkness. "Will you help me find them?" It rasped and took a skittering, unnatural step towards her, the sound of small, bare bones scraping against the hardwood floor. The weight of the day pressed Ivan down into his mattress, a physical force of exhaustion. The drone of the factory, the endless clanking of machinery, still echoed in his ears, a phantom tinnitus that was the soundtrack to his life. He could still taste the metallic tang of the air on his tongue as he kicked off his steel-toed work boots. They hit the floor with a heavy, final thud. He didn't bother changing, the grime and sweat a familiar second skin he'd grown numb to. His small apartment was less a home and more a cell, where he served his sentence of sleep. He fell into that sleep instantly, a dark, dreamless blanket he pulled gratefully over his head, desperate for oblivion. He wasn't sure what pulled him back out of it. It wasn't a noise, not at first. It was a vibration, a subtle rhythmic disturbance that managed to burrow through the deep layers of his slumber like a worm through soil. He surfaced slowly, reluctantly, his mind thick with cotton. Then he heard it. Ivan's eyes fluttered open to the familiar, oppressive shadows of his small bedroom. The moonlight filtered through the grimy window pane cast long, distorted shapes across the floor, making the mundane seem monstrous. He lay perfectly still, his body leaden, listening. Had he dreamt it? The factory sounds often followed him home, clanking and whirring in his dreams. There it was again, clearer this time. It was a dry, insistent sound, full of a patient, unnerving persistence, like a rat sharpening its claws on wood. But it was too slow, too deliberate for a rat. A cold knot of unease tightened in his stomach. He held his breath, straining his ears, trying to pinpoint the source. The sound was close, terribly close. It was coming from his closet. His gaze snapped to the tall wooden wardrobe that stood against the far wall, a bulky silhouette in the gloom. The door was closed, just as he'd left it. He tried to reason with the fear that was beginning to prickle his skin like 1,000 tiny needles. It was just the old building settling, the pipes groaning. His tired mind, overworked and underfed, was playing tricks on him. It had to be. This time it was longer, a drawn-out gouge, followed by a soft, dragging sound, like a burlap sack full of something heavy being pulled across a splintered surface. A wave of goosebumps washed over him. He sat up slowly, the cheap mattress creaking a loud protest in the sudden silence. The room was still again, save for the frantic, rabbit-like thumping of his own heart against his ribs. He stared at the closet, every nerve in his body screaming a silent alarm. He thought about the stories his old babushka used to tell him, tales of things that hid in the dark places of homes, the forgotten corners and the deep wardrobes. She spoke of the screb, the scratcher, a creature drawn to exhaustion and loneliness, a thing that waited for you to be alone, too tired to fight back. He'd always laughed them off as old-world superstitions. He wasn't laughing now. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The silence was somehow worse than the noise, pregnant with dreadful possibility. He was just about to convince himself it had all been a waking nightmare when a new sound emerged from the closet. A soft, wet clicking. It was a sound that had no business being in his room. It was organic, guttural, obscene. The sound of a tongue lolling against teeth that were too large, too numerous. A low whimper escaped Ivan's lips before he could stop it. He clamped a hand over his mouth, his eyes stretched wide in the gloom, reflecting the pale moonlight like polished stones. A faint, cloying smell, like damp soil and rotting meat, drifted from the wardrobe. Then he saw it. The closet door, the one he knew he had shut, began to move. It wasn't swinging open. It was being pushed slowly from the inside. A dark vertical slit widened inch by agonizing inch. The scraping sound returned, louder now, frantic and sharp. Whatever was inside was clawing at the door, desperate to get out. Ivan was paralyzed by a terror so profound it felt like a physical blow, stealing the air from his lungs. He couldn't scream. He couldn't run. He could only watch as the gap in the closet door grew wider, revealing a sliver of absolute impenetrable blackness, a void that seemed to drink the moonlight and exude a palpable cold. From that sliver of darkness, a single pale finger emerged. It was impossibly long and thin, like a bleached root pulled from the earth, tipped with a jagged, yellowed nail caked with something dark. It hooked around the edge of the door, the nail digging into the wood, leaving a deep, vertical scratch. Then, another finger joined it, and another, their movements jerky and unnatural. A whole hand, skeletal and white, curled around the doorframe. The wet clicking grew louder, and a low whisper slithered into the room, a sibilant hiss that didn't form words, but carried a clear ancient malice, a promise of pain. The hand began to pull. The closet door groaned open wider. Ivan finally found his voice. A choked, strangled cry tore from his throat as he scrambled backward off the bed, stumbling and crashing hard against the wall. He couldn't take his eyes off the widening abyss of the closet. He could see a shape beginning to unfold itself from the shadows within. A tall, hunched silhouette that didn't fit the dimensions of the space it occupied. Its limbs bent at angles that were entirely wrong, snapping and cracking as it straightened itself out, its head scraping the ceiling of the wardrobe. It was time to run. He lurched for the bedroom door, his fingers fumbling for the cold brass knob. Behind him, he heard a sickening crack, the sound of a neck popping into place. The whispering was all around him now, seeming to come from every corner of the room at once, coalescing into a single, stretched-out sound that almost resembled his name. He wrenched the door open and plunged into the hallway, not daring to look back, not wanting the final image of his life to be the thing that was unfurling from his closet. He didn't stop running until he burst out into the cold night air, the sharp gravel of the street biting mercilessly into his bare feet. He ran and ran, the awful rhythmic sound of scraping echoing not from the apartment, but from the dark, terrified corners of his own mind. He knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that he could run for the rest of his life, but he would never truly get away. Some doors, once opened, could never be closed again.